Hello people, how are you doing? Welcome back to another video from the React series, and today we're going to get started with something very special. It's called Redux. I've been getting a lot of requests to get started with the Redux, and it took some time because I wanted to clarify a lot of fundamental stuff first and then get into a little bit complex topic like Redux. In this video, we are going to just touch the top portion, the iceberg, the top of the iceberg in this particular video. Redux is much more than that. But fundamental first, guys. So we're going to talk about fundamentals, and once you understand the fundamentals, I think rest of the things are going to be much easier for you. Codes, syntax are something that you will get much faster. Alright, so let's get started with this one. But before that, I would like to request you to subscribe to this channel because I keep sharing a lot of fundamental aspects and I get good feedback from you guys that you like it. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, any doubts after you go through this video, please put a comment in the comment section of this video or reach out to me on Twitter, DM me. I'll try to clarify your doubts. Alright, so let's get started. So before we start with Redux, let us talk about a few expectations and boundaries. The expectations are such that you need to keep in mind while studying Redux. The first one is Redux is not related to React. Redux is an independent JavaScript architecture for dealing with the state in predictable way. We were going to learn all of that in much more deep sense, in this particular video. But we are going to talk Redux with React because we are learning Redux as part of this React series. You will be able to use Redux, without React, you can use it with Vue or Angular or plain JavaScript as well. We will learn the things slowly because we are covering fundamentals. We learn things slowly but steadily. It means that we will be starting with the fundamentals, then slowly getting into learning the code, then putting the pieces together, try to build the application. That's what this mini series is about. Mini series on Redux is about. Okay, we will code, but not always. For example, when you are actually talking about fundamentals or the fundamental concepts, we'll more look into a lot of code snippets, see like how they are kind of get used to push this particular concept forward. But we don't want to jump into the syntax just from the beginning, so that looking into the syntax will be more overwhelmed. So better first understand the base, understand the fundamentals. And after each video, you need to practice. So whatever you are learning, you need to probably practice that. You can read from many other resources or go through the video once again. If you don't understand anything, please reach out to me on Twitter or as a comment into this video. I'll try my best to kind of get the answer back. Then the boundaries. The boundaries is like we'll start with Redux what and why. Then we'll start learning something called Redux Toolkit. So there are various ways we can actually do Redux. The modern, in today's world, standing today, the most modern thing is the Redux Toolkit. People call it RTK as well. So we'll learn what is the RTK. We'll look into the Redux implementation. We'll start with a JavaScript, non-React JavaScript Redux implementation, then get into React using RTK and try to see how it can be, how we do the varying with Redux and React together. Then we'll see the data flow, what exactly the data flow in depth. We'll talk about something called middleware. We'll see how to kind of intercept the asynchronous call and do some of these things, with it. We will touch base with RTK queries, and then we will talk about Redux versus Use Reducer hook. So there could be some misconception hey, Redux and Use Reducer are the kind of complement each other, or Use Reducer is kind of going to take the Redux out of the market. There could be various different questions or concerns in mind. We're going to answer that part of that. And then we're also going to talk about Redux and context APIs, how we can actually use them together, how both of them can live together. So that's a big piece that we're going to kind of talk about, at the end. But today's video is going to focus on this part. It is going to focus on Redux, what and why part. And this is the most fundamental part where I want you to pay a lot of attention. And once you do that, you will be able to understand code syntaxes, the APIs, the flows and everything much easily. Alright, so let's get into the next one. This is an old image that I have used in the beginning of this React series. What this picture is about, that each of this yellow boxes that we see over here are nothing but components, right, in React. Each of these blue circles that we see is the state of the component, and each of these red we see are the props that actually get passed from one component to another component. Why we are getting this particular image again, or why are we revisiting this particular image again? Just to give you an idea, just a kind of recap, that in React, if you think in React, there are a bunch of components available. The components has something called private data, which is like state. What is the state? The state actually shows what is the current behavior of a component in React. What is the current behavior of that portion of the UI that component is serving? That's what exactly state is. So whenever the state changes, the behavior of that particular UI will also get changed. So for example, if there is a count, say 0, and there is a button somebody click and the count incremented, that is a state change, because the behavior was before to show the count 0. Now because of this button click, the count value got changed to 1. So there is a behavioral change. So the state change. So that is how the state is there inside the component. And then when two components wants to talk to each other, they usually talks using something called props. So it is unidirectional from parent to child. So parents supply the props to child, again from child to grandchild, and so on. The props get passed in the hierarchy. In few videos back, we actually discussed about something called context APIs. We told that, okay, if the props are kind of getting passed too much deep down, it is going to create some kind of problem. Like how much deep down we want to kind of pass the props, rather we want to share the information across the hierarchy in some ways. That's why we introduce context APIs. Okay, that's good. Today we are going to talk about Redux to solve another fundamental problem. The problem is definitely about the props drilling, the way that we are actually passing the props throughout the hierarchy. Or there is another problem that can come about the lifting of the state. For example, parent to child, you are passing the props, but from child you want to access something or do certain modification or do certain updates on the state of the parent. You have to do in a different way. For example, you have to pass a function from the parent to child, and then the child invoke that function. Part of that invocation, the state gets updates in the parent. So this kind of thing that you need to do. Now doing it for a very simple components where like two components are there, we won't mind. But think about it like from deep down here, somewhere, from this hierarchy or from this hierarchy, somebody has to update a state which is there in the parent. That's when the challenge started coming in. So one thing is like, how do you update the state from any corner of the hierarchy? That's where the problem comes with our usual props way of drilling thing. And the second way of correctly tracking, like who is really updating the state and why. What is the reason? As a developer, we don't want to really spend a lot of time just debugging. We want to also understand like why certain problem arises, track that right way. So that is what is also can be a problem if we are kind of keep passing things and don't have a trace, don't have a tracking mechanism like why a state is getting updated, what is updating the state, right? So these are the problems that we are dealing with. And Redux is going to solve this problem some ways. That's what we are going to see right now. So before we get further, let's see a very simple code. This is a React code, a simple cart component. What it is doing basically, it has a state. So this is the state, the cart state. And this is the cart state that we are showing over here. And it has two buttons. If you click on plus, it is going to increment it by 1. We are going to show that incremented value. And if you are clicking on minus button, it is going to decrement it by 1. You are going to see the updated value. This is, we have done so many times in React. But let's break things a little bit more so that we start understanding it a little bit more fundamentally. So we know about state. Now let's see, like this is an action, like removing from cart or adding to a cart, a kind of actions that we are performing whenever we are clicking on a button, right? These are the actions that we are performing. And these are the event handler, which is dispatching the action. The word dispatching means sending, in some sort of sending. So we are actually sending some signal like, hey, this is the action to perform whenever I am clicking on this button. This is the action to perform whenever I am clicking on this button. And what is happening? When the action happens, I am actually updating the state. And we are updating the view with the current state. You see, this is how a simple component that also works. That is how it manages the state, right? So if you see from the simplicity perspective, you have a view. From view, there is an action. So the dispatch happened and action update the state, and the view is getting the current state. That is what the thing is we are dealing with, right? Now, where Redux come into the picture? What is Redux and what kind of problem it solves? This is what we are going to get into. But before that, some of the terminologies I want to kind of inject so that you start understanding things kind of much better way. Okay, so for the simple application, there is no problem. Now let's take an example of a little bit bigger application. Let's talk about a store. The store could be an online store or could be, some grocery store in your neighborhood. Let's assume that. And let's say that there is a customer and the customer has added certain things into the cart, and after that he has to go to the biller for billing it, right? So this is the flow in a regular, shop that we kind of gets into. So the customer add to cart, some of the things, and he or she can also remove from cart after adding into. So different kind of things that a customer can do. And one customer is satisfied, like this is the thing that they are going to buy. They goes to the biller and request to check out. What biller does, it creates a bill or invoice and then actually help to check out the customer. And also biller updates certain things like the customer data, who has visited the store and how much fund probably the store has got. Some of this thing can happen. Now this application, if we have to design in React, it is little bit complex than just doing the cart, because the cart is just the one part. There are multiple things that this particular application has to deal with, and that multiple things that particular application has to deal with is kind of in terms of state, right? It's not only the cart anymore, it should be something more. So what are the state? It could be items, the items in the cart, the cash that, the amount that the store is getting, that's something that need to deal with. And also it needs to deal with the customer data, because the biller is updating the customer data. Now let's say this particular store is showing these items, like how many items got added to the cart, how much money this particular store is earning, and how many customers the store is visiting this particular day. Now if this is the data, these are the data this application shows, it means we have to manage this data for this application as state. Because if an item added to the cart, the value for that items is going to change. If somebody is buying something, the cash value for the store is going to change. If a new customer coming to the store, the customer value is going to change, right? So we need to do this kind of tracking, that how the state is going to change, we need to know properly. And now it's a little bit of bigger application than the previous one we have seen. So you have to also make sure that none of the states are getting updated very randomly. They are getting updated properly. They are getting managed in the proper ways, right? But before we talk more about the proper and the right way of doing it, let's try to understand one more thing over here. So what are those factors? What are those things possibly going to update this state? What are those things? So there are certain actions that kind of update this state. For example, add or remove to the cart is going to update the items. Creating invoice, this is probably going to do the cash. Updating the customer data is going to update the customer things. Updating the inventory or cash is also going to update the stuff. So in the little bit complex application, you have to not only deal with the state, like what gets updated, you also have to mentally think about like what are the things possibly can make this thing update. And once you identify that, what you're talking about predictability. That means whenever there is an action for add or removing from the cart, the item state is going to get updated. Whenever there is an update inventory or cash, the cash state is going to get updated. Whenever there is an update into the customer data, the customer state going to get updated. You are now talking more about the predictable manner, because you are trying to associate some way action and state together. But how are they get associated to? We're going to see that. Now, let's see, like when the application gets bigger, what kind of problem that we might face. So when application gets bigger, we can face the problem of the state can be managed multiple ways and then from the multiple places. These are the two major problems that you will see in application which is kind of growing bigger. state management should be really proper, then there is no proper tracking, like who has updated the state at what point of time. That's a bigger problem. If there is no tracking and if there is a bug, it will take a lot of time identifying like what would have caused this particular bug. Then there are higher chances of polluting the state. If there are no tracking, there could be a chance that we are polluting the state, and then there is no predictability. So all this thing adds into the predictability factor. So we see like when the application grows bigger, there are chances of this problem. So what is the solution of the problem? So one of the solutions that we all talk about is Redux. Okay, so here comes Redux. Let's understand, let's spend some time understanding what exactly it is. So Redux is an architectural concept, okay, to manage the application state predictably. We just now have seen with the example of that shop, the store, is like there are chances as the application grows, the predictability in managing the state may go for toss. So what we need to do is like we need to have some ways where we should be able to manage the state predictability. That's what Redux comes in. But how? How does it do it? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a few how, and there I am going to highlight a few words. Some words will be highlighted in orange color, some words will be underlined. The one with the orange color you have to give special attention to, because those are the heart of Redux. We are going to talk in and out in this series about those terms again and again, and in the next 10 to 15 minutes you are going to understand them in much better way. Okay, so how? A centralized store for state for the entire application. Okay, so the term store and the state is something that you need to keep in mind. We are going to do explanation of that in a while. But the store is centralized, so it means that the state is now not getting stored in per component or in a multiple places. It is going to store globally for the entire application, only one store. And in the store, there is the state that is getting maintained. What is the state over here? It's a plain JavaScript object. It's a plain JavaScript object where the entire application's state will be maintained. Next, you cannot make a mutable update to the state. What is mutable? Mutable means something that you can change. Immutable is the opposite of that. That is where you cannot change, something. So what does it mean? It means that you cannot change the state directly. To do the state changes, you have to come in certain ways. You have to follow certain principles. And that is what brings a lot of predictability. Because now, what you are doing, you are following certain processes. Before the process was not in place, you could do the state update in whatever ways possible. But right now, there is a fixed process that we are going to talk about. So, all the updates for the state can be done immutably. We will see what exactly immutably means. But keep in mind. Next, the UI or the view part of it dispatches something called action to update the state in the global store. We have seen one example is like button is getting clicked, it is dispatching something like an action, and the action is doing the state changes. In a very normal component also, we have seen that. Same thing over here, but you have to keep pay attention over here, like whenever the action is getting dispatched, it updates the state in the global store, because in Redux, there is only global store, and that is what we need to update. Can it update directly? No, it cannot do this update directly. We have to write a code logic that actually updates the state immutably. We again will see what exactly immutably. Immutably means as the state is represented by JavaScript object, we won't be updating the state directly. Rather, we will be doing a clone or copy of that object and then do an update on this and then return that copied object. We will be never ever update the state directly. We'll see the example in a while. So, but there is something called reducer, basically. Something called reducer, which is nothing but a bunch of code logic, JavaScript code logic. That is through that you can only update the state in an immutable way and then return the updated state back to the UI. The UI gets the updated state. Okay, so now we have heard certain terminologies. Let's get over them once more, because this might get a little bit overwhelmed, but don't worry, we'll get into that. We'll kind of break it. So a centralized store for state for the entire application, fine. There is only one store, one state for the entire application, and the state is represented by a plain old JavaScript object. The state cannot be changed directly. That's why it is immutable. State can only be changed in the immutable way. It means that you can clone that and then do the update on the cloned object and return the updated object. You don't change the state directly. Okay. Whenever UI dispatches an action, what happens is that that action and the current state gets into reducer. Reducer does that updates in the immutable way and return the updated state. The UI that subscribed for the state updates gets the updated state. So, great part over here is like you have an action. So, through that action, we know like what is the purpose of a state update is coming. There is a reducer where you can write the logic in a proper way of handling a state update than doing in multiple places. You have only say one root reducer, where there are it handling multiple actions, and for each of the actions you are handling the state update. Okay. Now let's do one thing. The same lines over here, but we'll be extracting out all these terms: dispatch, action, reduce, state, store, or other way. Store, state, reducer, action, dispatch. We have what we have done. We have extracted out all these terms because these are the primary terms we told that we'll be discussing right now. Fair enough. But what is also there is like there are other terms which are like underlined. For example, UI view, current state, update, centralize, and things like that, right? Now all these things are related, and what we're going to see right now is like how these things are related. Okay, so let's see that. So first is like whenever there is something happen on the UI, an action or an event happen, what UI does, UI dispatch an action. Okay, you see this arrow, UI dispatch an action. Whenever the action comes, the action and the current state in the UI, these two things gets into the reducer. Okay, so I got the current state from the store, I got the action, these two things gets into the reducer. Reducer is a logic, a plain JavaScript logic, which check the action and check the current state and say like, okay, what kind of action I'm going to perform. What it does is basically it actually going to clone this current state and do an update into this particular state. Okay, that's what reducer does. Action has two properties. Okay, one is called type, where you have to declare like what kind of action you're going to do. For example, adding to the cart, removing to the cart. The type is a kind of string type value. It can be anything, any string. And there will be another thing called payload. Through payload, you can pass certain data while performing this action. We're going to see that in the code in a while. So action is again a plain old JavaScript object can have two properties. One is type, another is payload. The type says what kind of action you're going to perform, and in the type you can specify any string value of your choice, and the value at the payload is the value that you'll be passing and using it inside the reducer, along with the action type to do something. So in reducer you'll be checking, hey, if the type is add and the payload I got say +2, I get the current state and do +2, and then I'm actually getting an updated state. And this updated state finally gets back to your UI view. Okay, so this is how the Redux works at a very high level. Okay, let's do it again. You have a UI, you dispatch an action. Okay, you have an action, and then whenever the action gets dispatched, there is reducer. So reducer gets is the action just now got dispatched and gets the current state. What reducer check is the action's type. See like, oh, this is the action that we're going to perform. Check the current state and check whether the action has got a payload. Take the payload value, perform all the things that it wants to do, update the state and gets back to the UI. In the reducer, you as a developer write the logic. You decide, like based on this action type, what am I supposed to do? It is not automatic. There is no magic. This is only code. This is only logic that you will be doing, right? So this is how the things work. Now what we're going to do is basically, we're going to see an UI. And in that UI, we are going to see like how the Redux can perform certain things together. Okay, so let's see that UI in a bit. Okay, so here is the UI. What exactly it does? It's a black circle, nothing more than that, and there are a bunch of buttons below. So the expectation over here is like whenever I click on this red, the color should be red. That's all, right? Now if I tell you to write this in a in React without using Redux. I'm sure that you'll be able to do it very quickly. But for simplicity, we want to demonstrate this one using Redux so that you understand the concept well, and then we'll get into a little bit more complex thing. Okay. So we have a black thing and we actually click on it and we want it to turn red, but this implementation we want to do with Redux. Now, for Redux, there should be something called an initial state. The state that this particular UI has built with, the initial state. So what could be the initial state for this? The initial state could be the color of this circle. So this is the initial state. We have a color and the code is, say, this black color. So this is the initial state this particular UI got. In the JSX, we actually read that code and the black color we got. Now, if I click on this, remember, I click on this means I'll be dispatching an action. So this is the button where you have an on click, and what I'm doing, I'm dispatching an action. Okay, I'm calling a function called dispatch, which I have written, a function called dispatch, and I'm dispatching an action. I told that action is a JavaScript object, has two properties. One is type, another is payload. Type says like what kind of action it is. This is completely up to you what name you give. So I give as a change color, try to give something meaningful, of course. And the payload is the value that I want to pass to my reducer to do my logic. So I'm going to dispatch this particular action to my reducer. So this is the reducer that I have written, which is like, again, a plain JavaScript function, which takes two parameters I told. One is the action, another is the current state. Okay, action and the current state. So this is the state that is coming. So what is the action? In the action, we have type and we have payload. We are checking that if the type is change color, okay, if the type is change color, this two should match, then do some logic. This logic, nothing but I am changing the state immutably. So if you see that I am using the spread operator over there so that it creates a clone of the actual state. It's not mutating the actual state directly. Clone the actual state and then also clone the nested object, and then actually I am updating it with the payload value that I am passing over here. Payload.code is red. That is how the code is going to be, right? Now if this state gets changed and it gets returned from here, right? And if my UI gets it, of course, this is going to be red because it was actually listening for this color code to change, and the color code has got changed in this way. Now, this is a very simple application, but we have demonstrated in a Redux way to make sure that we understand the concept clearly. We understand what is action for, how action is related to reducer, who is the brain here doing all the job, and how the state gets finally updated. Did we update the original state that we have started with? We have not. What we have done here is like we have created a clone, updated it, and pushed that updated one to this particular UI. Isn't that great? Yeah, you may think, isn't that too much to do? Yes, I will say definitely it is too much to do for an application like changing a circle's color from one to another. Now think about a case. In this case, if your application grows, for example, you have this particular circle where you are changing the color. There is possibly another UI component where you are changing the size. There is another UI component where you are actually changing the opacity of a square. There is another UI component where there is a slider through that you are changing the text size and things like that, and it kind of keep growing. Now you are getting into the complexity. You have to maintain the state for each of these components wherever the states are, state changes are required. But those states can be maintained and managed globally, like, color, code, opacity, font, size, the typography and things like that could be one state, one global state managed. And whatever is required, whatever the portion required for a particular component, it can actually update only that particular portion and give it back to the same component for its rendering purpose. So as the things gets more complex, as the things gets more bigger, that's when you will start thinking about whether I should be using Redux or not. Until then, you are very good with whatever the way you are doing. You are very good with the props passing. You are very good with the context and things like that, right? So it is definitely too much to do, no doubt about it. But you need to know, like, when are you going to use Redux? So use Redux when you have a large application state that is needed in many components of the app. You use Redux then. That's one of the indicators that you might want to use it. Or the state gets updated very, very frequently, right? So then you need the predictability. That's why you will be using the Redux. Then state update logic is quite complex. You want to isolate them in the reducer. So you have seen the reducer is the guy which actually does the logic of state update. So you can actually isolate that. And then your app code size is growing. That's why you want to kind of take your state update and things like that in much more modular way. You will be doing that. And the last thing is like whenever you think it's the right time to use Redux, do that. So the first 4 points are just kind of the way to kind of tell that when possibly the right time. That's there in the documentation as well. But finally, as a developer, when you see that managing state is becoming more difficult, debugging things are getting more difficult, it is a bit difficult to kind of handle the complex state update logic. I think it's time that you should think in Redux way, right? So that's pretty much it that I wanted to kind of cover in this video. I wanted to give you a highlight of what Redux is about, what are the different terminologies we use, and what those terminologies stand for. And then in the next video, when we're getting into the coding, we'll be building a simple application using Redux, first using normal JavaScript, plain JavaScript, no React, and then a React application using Redux. You will be able to relate, hey, I know that we have learned about the state, which is nothing but a plain JavaScript object, takes two properties like type and payload. Type can be a string. We determine in the reducer, like, what is the operation that I have to perform, and payload can be any valid JavaScript value that I can pass to reducer and take some action based on my business logic. Okay. So dispatching an action happen probably with certain kind of events whenever I have to change the state. I never ever change the state directly. I do an immutable way. I'm doing the changes in a sense is like I clone, I copy the portion of the state that I want to kind of change, and I change it and I return it from the reducer, and whatever the UI subscribe for the state changes, they get notified, they get the current state, getting the current state, they change their UI accordingly. So it means if you have 5 components and out of that only 2 components subscribe to state changes, they get the state change and those 2 components selectively gets updated, wherever those other 3 components probably they're as it is because there is no state changes. So this is what the Redux, my friend, at a very high level. It is not complex. It is just that the foundation, just that the fundamental stuff we need to focus on and just need to keep it in our mind. Hey, reducer is the logic which does the state changes. Action is something to tell like how to do the state changes and how the things are kind of bind together. I hope you got it. I hope you enjoyed listening to me in this video. I have not done much of coding. In the next one, we'll start creating application using Redux. Okay. So until then, take great care of yourself and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much.